The universe had developed a rather inconvenient habit of spawning things that made everyone wish they'd stayed home. Things with teeth. Things with claws. Things that looked at a fully armed battleship and thought it looked like an appetizer. The galaxy, that shimmering tapestry of 7,000 inhabited systems and approximately 40,000 different ways to regret your life choices, had seen plenty of horrors. But the Alpha Killers, now those were something special. They were the kind of special that made even the ancient Vithrani, who'd been around since before stars had names, nervously check their door locks. Sector Command's emergency alert system had been screaming for exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes. The sound was less of an alert and more of a desperate wail, the kind of noise that made you wonder if someone's computer had learned how to panic. The command center itself was a chaotic symphony of organized chaos, if such a thing could exist without being a contradiction. Which it was, but it existed anyway. Holographic displays flickered across every surface, each one screaming statistics about Alpha Killer movements in the outer terminus region. The creatures had hit 3 stations in 4 cycles. 3 stations. The body count wasn't even being discussed in polite company anymore, because calling something a body count implied there were enough bodies left to count. The reports just said no survivors and left it at that. Survivors weren't part of the Alpha Killer's vocabulary, which, to be fair, probably consisted of nothing but hissing and the sound of bones breaking. Admiral Huxos stood at the command center's observation window, his crystalline form refracting the starlight into anxious rainbow. His species, the Lumineth, had evolved on a planet where everything tried to kill you, so they developed psychic shielding and an affinity for defensive strategies. Right now, both were doing him absolutely no good. Behind him, the Varoshi command staff chittered nervously in their staccato language that sounded like an argument between caffeinated insects. The hegemony's representatives had stopped speaking altogether, which meant they were either formulating a strategy or composing their final prayer, probably both. Earth's liaison officer, a grizzled woman with the kind of scars that suggested she'd survived things the Varoshi wouldn't even dream about, sat in the corner working on a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been processed through a chemical plant. Nobody bothered. Everyone at Sector Command had learned that humans had a relationship with caffeine that bordered on religious devotion. Interfering was considered a war crime in most human legal systems, or so she'd mentioned at the last strategy meeting. The information cascading across the displays told a story nobody wanted to read. The Alpha Killers were massive, maybe 3 times the size of a combat drone, and they moved like something that had forgotten that physics was supposed to be a limiting factor. Their skin was impossible to penetrate with standard weapons. They regenerated faster than medical technology could theoretically allow. They hunted in coordinated packs that demonstrated strategic thinking, which meant they were intelligent, organized, and absolutely dedicated to turning everyone into a historical footnote. Previous expeditions sent to contain them had returned as small, deeply traumatized fragments of previous expeditions. Some had just returned as fragments. The ones who'd made it back in one psychological piece all said the same thing. The Alpha Killers weren't just predators. They were something evolution had designed specifically to ensure nothing would ever sleep peacefully again. Admiral Huxos had called in favors from 3 different galactic powers. He'd assembled the finest military minds from 12 species. They'd run simulations, thousands of them. The results were consistently, relentlessly depressing. Every scenario ended with the same conclusion. Containment was impossible. The best they could hope for was slowing the inevitable, like trying to stop a nova with a stern conversation. The view screen flickered, and for a moment the assembled leadership thought perhaps reality had decided to take mercy on them. It hadn't. The alert system wailed louder, if such a thing were possible, which apparently it was. The Killers had just entered a new sector, a sector that happened to contain one of the galaxy's largest civilian settlement hubs. Admiral Huxos was already composing the evacuation order in his head when the command center doors hissed open with the kind of finality that suggested whoever was coming through wasn't asking permission. Everyone looked up, expecting perhaps a high-ranking military officer, or maybe a member of the Galactic Council. What they got instead was a human woman in a courier's uniform that had seen better years, better decades really, carrying a single data pad like it was the universe's most casual delivery. She moved through the chaos with the kind of confidence that came from either absolute certainty or complete detachment from the concept of consequences. Probably both, in typical human fashion. Her boots tracked something brown and unidentifiable across the pristine command center floor, which made the Varoshi staff hyperventilate in their staccato way. She walked straight past Admiral Huxos, ignored the security protocols that were supposedly activated, and set the datapad down on the nearest available surface, which happened to be a map showing the Alpha Killer territory expansion. The Lumineth Admiral started to object, his crystalline form beginning to glow in that threatening way that usually preceded someone having a very bad day. But the woman beat him to it. She tapped her foot on the floor, a rhythmic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence, and said with the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather, "Sector Command issued alerts regarding the Alpha Killers." "Yeah, I've dealt with worse things before Actually, scratch that. I used their pelts for a bedroom rug." The command center went so quiet you could hear someone's internal organs screaming from across the room. The Varoshi actually stopped chittering. A Varoshi stopping mid-chitter was like a star stopping mid-shine. It violated the fundamental laws of their existence. Admiral Huxos stared at her for a long moment, his crystalline form now cycling through colors that indicated either profound confusion or the beginning stages of a neural shutdown. The human Earth liaison in the corner looked up from her coffee, and for the first time in 6 hours, a smile crossed her face. It wasn't a pleasant smile, it was the kind of smile that suggested humanity had just played a card everyone had forgotten was in the deck. "That," said the woman in the Courier uniform, gesturing at the holographic displays still screaming their terrible news, "is adorable, but you've got bigger problems than you realize. And somebody needs to explain that to your command structure before they make a decision that gets more people killed than necessary. So, shall we start with what you actually know about the Alpha Killer? Or should I just start with the part where your entire defensive strategy is basically pray a lot?" She pulled up a chair, not bothering to wait for an invitation, and adjusted her posture with the kind of ease that came from absolute familiarity with situations that would have other species filing their final will. Admiral Huxos took approximately 3 seconds to process what had just happened, which for a Lumineth was equivalent to contemplating the meaning of existence while simultaneously solving advanced physics equations. When he finally managed to emit coherent sounds, they came out as a harmonious tone that roughly translated to "explain yourself before I have you vaporized." The human woman didn't look particularly intimidated. She looked, if anything, mildly amused by the threat, which in itself was a threat. Humans had a reputation for being dangerously casual about danger. They'd evolved on a planet where literally everything wanted them dead, and instead of developing psychic shields or crystalline armor, or the ability to detoxify anything through sheer biological spite, they'd just developed an absolutely stellar capacity for sarcasm and an unhealthy attachment to duct tape. Somehow this worked. "Right. So, hostile introductions," the Courier said, pulling up files on the datapad with the casual expertise of someone who'd infiltrated command centers before. "Let me guess, you've got no intel on the actual behavior patterns beyond they kill everything. Your weapons testing showed negative results across the board. Your simulations probably ended with everyone dead in creative new ways. And your big strategic plan right now is basically controlled retreat while hoping they decide to nap for a few centuries." "How'd I do?" The Varoshi chittering resumed, but it was faster now, the acoustic equivalent of panicked whispering. A humanoid figure from the hegemony, all sharp angles and calculating eyes, leaned forward. "Your credentials suggest you're a courier, a delivery person. How exactly would a delivery person possess classified information about threats that only Sector Command should know about?" The human laughed. It was a sound like gravel in a blender, rough and genuinely amused. "Because I wasn't always a delivery person. I was a xenobiologist, then I was a soldier, then I was a prisoner, then I was a slave laborer on a mining colony. Then I escaped, and there's a really boring 15-year gap where I did stuff that would require a lot of paperwork to explain. But about 6 years ago, I ran into one of your Alpha Killers on a salvage operation." She pulled up a video file, And the command center went still in that special way it did when everyone was about to see something their brains weren't equipped to process. The footage was shaky, taken from what looked like a handheld device or maybe a helmet camera. It showed a creature that could only be described as a nightmare. Someone had decided to grant physical form. It was roughly the size of a cargo shuttle, covered in what looked like segmented armor plating, with appendages that moved with nauseating fluidity. Its head, if it could be called that, was mostly mouth and intention. "That's HD footage," the hegemony representative asked, his voice suggesting he thought the woman had tampered with the video to make things look worse than they actually were. Denial was apparently a cross-species constant. Ultra HD, actually, taken from about 200 meters away, the Courier replied. "And yeah, I know what you're thinking. That thing is huge and ugly and everything in between. But here's what you don't know. They've got a weak Turns out that all that regenerative capability comes from a biological quirk nobody's bothered to research. Because shockingly, most people who encounter these things don't live long enough to do field work." Admiral Hutsas's crystalline form pulsed with interest, the colors shifting to something resembling cautious hope. "You're saying the creatures have a vulnerability." "I'm saying the creatures have several," the Courier corrected, advancing through the footage. The video zoomed in on the creature's underside, where the armor plating looked slightly less impenetrable. Their regeneration is connected to a series of distributed neural nodes running along their anterior body. Destroy enough of them simultaneously, and the regenerative process goes haywire. The creature essentially tries to heal damage that technically doesn't exist anymore, which causes a cascade failure in the biological system. The Viroshi had stopped chittering completely now. The silence was somehow worse than the panicked noise had been. The earthly Azan in the corner set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, the kind of care that suggested she was about to participate in a conversation that was going to change everything. "How many creatures did you kill?" she asked. Her voice was flat, conversational, but there was weight behind it, the weight of someone who understood exactly what the Courier was implying. 17, the Courier said without hesitation. "Over the course of 3 months, working alone. Once I figured out the neural node vulnerability, it became more of a logistics problem than a combat problem. They're intelligent, sure, strategically coordinated, definitely, but they're not particularly adaptable once you understand their biology." The hegemony representative stood up. "That's impossible. Your weapons couldn't have penetrated their armor plating." "I didn't use weapons," the Courier said, and she smiled. It was not the kind of smile that made people comfortable. It was the kind of smile that suggested humanity had a way of solving problems that other species hadn't even considered because it involved levels of brutal pragmatism that made conventional warfare look like cooperative negotiation. "I used shaped charges, high-grade explosives, and a really detailed understanding of anatomy. Turns out that if you understand where the neural nodes are positioned, you can trigger a cascade failure from the inside." And the creatures, for all their intelligence and regenerative capabilities, still need to actually process sensory input. They still need to move food through digestive systems. They still have biological pressure points. She advanced the footage again, showing the moment of detonation. The creature's body convulsed, movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated. Then it stopped moving entirely. The video ended. "You killed it alone," Admiral Hutsas said, his tone suggesting he was trying to reconcile this statement with the laws of physics and biology as he understood them. "I killed 17 alone," the Courier corrected, "and I'm just one human with biology training, salvage experience, and what people keep telling me is an unhealthy relationship with explosives. Now imagine if you had actual military support, equipment designed specifically for this task, coordinated strike teams working from actual tactical analysis instead of just trial and error." The earthly Azan was smiling again, that same dangerous smile from before. "You're saying the alpha killers are killable." "I'm saying they're already dead," the Courier replied. "They just didn't realize it yet. Your problem isn't that you don't have a way to kill them. Your problem is that you've been thinking about this like conventional warfare. You've got alien biology specialists, military tacticians, weapons engineers. Somewhere in this command center is probably an Xenup psychologist, or 3,
but you've got nobody who's willing to get down in the dirt with a creature, understand how it actually works at a fundamental level, and figure out the creative, brutal ways to make it stop being a problem. The Varoshi started chittering again, but it was different now. It was the sound of calculations being performed, of strategic reassessment happening at the cognitive level. The hegemony representative was reviewing the footage again, zooming in on the neural node placements, running calculations through visible mental effort. "Why are you telling us this?" asked Admiral Hutsus. "Why come here? Why not just go public with the information and let everyone figure it out?" The courier leaned back in her chair, which creaked under her weight in a way that suggested human durability extended to their effects. "Because 17 dead creatures aren't a trend. 17 dead creatures are an anomaly, but 17 dead creatures handled by one person, with the knowledge that hundreds of others exist, means someone needs to coordinate a response before panic turns this into a galactic extinction-level event. And I've already done my time being ignored while others suffered. So here we are." She gestured at the still screaming alert system. "Your people are panicking because they think they're facing an unstoppable force, but humans faced unstoppable forces for our entire evolutionary history. Everything on our planet was faster, stronger, or more dangerous than us, so we learned to be smarter, colder, more willing to embrace solutions that make other species uncomfortable." The earthly Azan stood up, walked over to the courier, and extended her hand. They shook hands with the kind of understanding that comes from shared experience with impossible situations. Around them, the Lumineth, Varoshi, and hegemony representatives started making calls to higher authorities, initiating scientific analysis of the footage, and generally beginning the process of transforming panic into action. Admiral Hutsus looked at the bedroom rug comment with new understanding. She hadn't been bragging, she'd been establishing credentials.
The next 6 hours descended into what could only be described as controlled bureaucratic pandemonium. The courier, whose name turned out to be Aldith Vex according to the datapad, sat in a secure briefing room while 3 separate scientific teams reviewed her footage, her methodology, and her documentation. The room itself was aggressively neutral, the kind of space designed to make people feel simultaneously important and under intense scrutiny. It was working. Aldith seemed entirely unbothered by the scrutiny. She'd crossed her feet on the conference table, a gesture that made the Lumeth scientific coordinator genuinely distressed, and proceeded to explain her methodology in excruciating detail. She'd brought actual biological samples preserved in stasis containers that showed alpha killer tissue degradation when exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies. She'd brought schematics for the explosive devices she'd used. She'd brought analysis of the neurological cascade failure and exactly which pressure points needed to be targeted. What she hadn't brought was humility. Humility, it seemed, was not part of the human emotional vocabulary. "So you're telling me," said Isam, the hegemony's chief xenobiologist reviewing tissue samples through a holographic microscope, "that you synthesized these neurological disruptors on a salvage station using basic equipment?" "I synthesized them using chemistry, some inspiration, and the industrial equipment already present on the station," Aldith corrected. "Which I should mention included a decent molecular synthesizer if you knew how to manipulate it correctly. Turns out that knowing how to work with limited resources is something humans are exceptionally good at. We've been doing it since before we figured out fire." The hegemony delegation had arrived about 3 hours into the analysis, along with representatives from the collective, and a somewhat suspicious contingent from the Outer Dominion. The Outer Dominion had a reputation for being extremely interested in weapons technology, and they were currently very interested in Aldith's methodology. They were also currently being politely but firmly denied any access to her operational detail. "The Alpha Killers are a threat to all spacefaring civilizations," Aldith had told them when they'd first tried to negotiate for exclusive access to her research. "I'm not making them worse by giving one faction a military advantage. So we work together, or we don't work at all. Those are your options." The Dominion had not been pleased. They'd also not had much choice. The datapad was in Sector Command's possession now, backed up in 3 separate secure servers, and Aldith had already provided the Earth Leone with a complete digital copy of everything. You couldn't unring that particular bell. Admiral Huxos had called in the High Council by way of emergency protocol. The High Council, that august body of representatives from the galaxy's most powerful factions, had initially been skeptic. Skepticism had transformed into cautious interest once they'd reviewed the evidence themselves. Interest had transformed into something approaching urgency when the second wave of Alpha Killer attacks hit. Not in the civilian sector, but in a military installation 3 regions over. No survivors from that station either. But there were wreckage analyses. And the wreckage showed clear patterns of damage that couldn't have been caused by Alpha Killers alone. Someone else was there, Aldith said, studying the damage reports with the kind of casual certainty that made the hegemony delegation visibly uncomfortable. Someone with conventional weapons technology. They tried to stop the creatures. The creatures then killed everyone and presumably moved on to find more entertainment elsewhere. The Earth liaison, whose name was actually Donovan Hayes despite her seemingly permanent residence in the corner with coffee, leaned forward. "You're saying another faction has already encountered the Alpha Killers?" "I'm saying another faction has already died to the Alpha Killers," Aldith corrected. "There's a difference. The wreckage patterns suggest they had decent defensive infrastructure. Military-grade weapons, standard alien combat technology. And they're still completely dead. So either your Alpha Killers have evolved in the 6 years since I last encountered them, which would be fascinating and terrible, or whoever showed up with conventional weapons just proved my point harder than I had to." The High Council's representative, a being who was technically classified as a sentient quantum phenomenon, but generally went by a name that roughly translated to witness, expressed its displeasure by dimming its luminescence. The effect was like watching a star get grumpy. "You're suggesting that conventional military responses to the Alpha Killer threat are ineffective." "I'm not suggesting," Aldith said. "I'm stating it as established fact. You've got the evidence right there. You want? I can pull up the tactical reports from the 3 stations that got hit in the outer terminus. Every single response followed standard military protocols. Every single response resulted in complete annihilation of personnel and infrastructure. The creatures don't adapt to conventional warfare, because conventional warfare isn't relevant to how they actually work." The Lumineth scientific coordinator began processing information through crystalline matrices that glowed brighter as calculations accumulate. "If your methodology proves effective, we could theoretically begin manufacturing the neural disruptors you designed. We could train rapid response teams. Within 6 months we could have containment protocols. Within 6 months you could have dead humans," Aldith replied flat. "Because implementing a new technology at scale requires testing. Testing requires volunteers. And volunteering to test weapons against creatures that kill everything they encounter means you're volunteering to die. So unless you've got something like 3,000 military personnel willing to become experimental subjects, you're looking at a much longer timeline." Hayes smiled into her coffee. "She's not wrong. Human military doctrine factors in acceptable casualty. Sounds like you'd be looking at 50% mortality on the testing phase alone." The Dominion representative made a sound that suggested they were processing the idea that killing a few thousand soldiers now might prevent killing billions of civilians later. Economics of sacrifice. It was a calculation every spacefaring civilization understood, but understanding and accepting were different things. "I'll need access to your complete biological analysis," Dr. Isom said. "My team can work on synthesizing the disruptors in greater quantity. We can potentially improve on your design, but I'm going to need you to walk me through your reasoning on every decision point." "Already prepared for that," Aldith said, and she transferred a massive data file through the secure network. "That's my complete research notes going back 12 years. Everything I've learned about Alpha Killer biology, behavior, psychology if you want to get philosophical about creature psychology. I left it all in there, including the mistakes. Especially the mistakes, because that's where the learning happened." The Outer Dominion representative tried to access the file before it was fully transferred. Sector Command's security caught the attempt, and terminated approximately 17% of the Dominion's on-site network infrastructure. As a matter of principle, relations between the Dominion and Sector Command had been tense before. They were now approaching actively hostile, but there was nothing the Dominion could do about it without looking like the aggressive faction trying to steal military research. So they sat there, calculating their options and finding them all equally unpleasant. Admiral Huxess called another emergency session of the High Council. By this point, 8 hours had passed since Aldith's arrival, and 3 separate military installations had reported Alpha Killer activity in their territories. The death toll was climbing into the millions. Populations of entire worlds were beginning evacuation protocols that everyone understood were mostly performative. You couldn't evacuate 1 billion people in the time it took for something to make the transition from space to ground. We need a response strategy, the witness said, its quantum fluctuations synchronized to something resembling urgency. The civilian populations are panicking. The military installations are requesting updated protocol. The Outer Dominion is making increasingly hostile noises about resource allocation. Then here's what you do, Aldith said. And she pulled up a strategic map that showed Alpha Killer movement patterns, population centers, and optimal deployment zones. You don't try to protect everywhere. That's impossible, and anyone who says otherwise is lying. You pick the installations with the best defensive infrastructure. You concentrate your resources there. You train rapid response teams using my methodology. You start hunting the creatures instead of defending against them. The hegemony representative looked disturbed. You're suggesting we abandon undefended populations. I'm suggesting you stop wasting soldiers, Aldith corrected. Every trained combat unit you send against these things with conventional weapons is a unit you're sending to their death. They will not accomplish anything, except making the creatures better at killing. But if you concentrate your best personnel, your most adaptable minds, your people who can think creatively about problems, and you give them the tools specifically designed to work against Alpha Killer biology, then you've got a chance of actually making a difference. She pulled up another analysis, this one showing casualty projections. The first strategy, conventional defense of multiple points, resulted in astronomical death tolls. The second strategy, focused response using Aldith's methodology, resulted in significantly lower casualty. The difference was stark enough to be uncomfortable. This assumes your methodology actually scales, the Lumenthith coordinator said. You killed 17 creatures. That's hardly a statistically significant sample size for determining effectiveness at the operational level required here. Fair point, Aldith acknowledged. But I'm also just one person. I'm not a soldier. I didn't have formal training in this. I had curiosity, biological knowledge, and access to explosive. So if you actually trained people, gave them better equipment, coordinated their efforts, the scaling becomes a mathematical certainty. Witness dimmed slightly, as though considering this logic. You're asking us to gamble on an untested strategy, while the threat continues to expand. I'm telling you that the tested strategies have already failed, Aldith said, and I'm offering an alternative that has a Nidzah success rate, which is better than what you've got right now. The High Council called for a vote. The measure passed with surprising unanimity, mostly because the alternative was political suicide. No representative wanted to explain to their constituency why they'd voted against the only viable defense strategy available. Within 2 hours, Sector Command had authorized the creation of 3 rapid response teams, selected from the most experienced personnel available. Aldith spent the next 4 hours walking them through Alpha Killer anatomy, vulnerability points, and optimal strike pattern. The teams watched her video footage. They studied her schematics. They asked questions that grew progressively more desperate, as the reality of what they were volunteering for began to settle in. The creatures will adapt, one human soldier said. His name tag read Gideon, and he had the kind of scars that suggested he'd survived impossible situations before. They're intelligent. Once they start losing packmates to this strategy, they'll change their behavior. Probably, Aldith agreed. But they'll change it slowly. Creatures that kill everything they encounter don't usually develop rapid evolutionary response strategies. They work because they don't need to adapt. When they suddenly do need to, they'll be playing catch-up. That's your window. And if they adapt anyway, asked someone from the Lumenthith contingent, her crystalline form already beginning to cycle through colors, indicating distress. Then you adapt faster, Aldith said. Because unlike them, you've got sapience. You've got technology. You've got the capacity to fundamentally rethink your approach. They've got teeth and spite.
I'm betting on sapience. But if I'm wrong, well, at least you tried. Hayes watched this exchange with something approaching parental pride. If parents could feel pride about someone else's daughter being both completely reckless and absolutely correct, simultaneous, by the time the strategy briefing concluded, the Alpha killer threat had expanded to 14 separate sectors. The projected casualty count was climbing toward the hundreds of millions if nothing changed. But now something was changing. Personnel were being mobilized. Equipment was being manufactured. The galaxy was, for possibly the first time in its recorded history, responding to an existential threat with something other than panic and conventional military doctrine. Aldith stood in the observation room of the command center, watching the deployment orders cascade across the displays. She was smiling, that dangerous smile that suggested she already knew how this was going to end. The Earth liaison joined her, offering her a fresh cup of coffee. That was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, Hayes said. Human strategy usually is both, Aldith replied. Usually at the same time. That's kind of our thing. She took a sip of the coffee, which tasted like something had been processed through a chemical plant, specifically designed to taste worse than the original chemical. It was perfect. It was human. It was the taste of someone who'd lived through impossible situations and refused to let them dictate her future. In the briefing room behind them, the hegemony, Lumenthith, and Witness were beginning to understand something fundamental. Humans weren't the weakest sapient species in the galaxy. They were just the ones who'd learned to survive everything else's attempts to eliminate them. That educational process left marks. 3 months after Aldith walked into Sector Command, the Alpha killer threat had been reduced by approximately 63. 3 rapid response teams had expanded to 19. The neural disruptor technology had been refined, weaponized and deployed across multiple military installations. The death toll had stopped climbing and started declining. It was still measured in the millions, but millions was infinitely better than the billions everyone had been projecting. The High Council convened for a formal commendation ceremony. This was the sort of bureaucratic theater that every galactic faction loved, where important things happened, but nothing actually changed because change required effort. Aldith was seated in the primary position of honor, which meant she was in the seat directly in front of the witness, and therefore directly in the line of intense quantum scrutiny. Humanity has proven itself to be an invaluable asset to galactic security. The witness announced its quantum fluctuations synchronized to something resembling genuine war, a species that has survived extinction-level threats through cunning and determination, now offers that expertise to all spacefaring civilizations. We propose formal recognition of human contribution to the Defense Alliance, with full voting rights on matters of galactic security. It was a significant gesture. Humanity's diplomatic position had shifted from that species that learned to make coffee from anything, to the species that understands survival at a level nobody else can match. The Lumenthith, Hegemony and Dominion all voted in favor. Witness didn't technically vote, existing as it did in a state of perpetual quantum superposition, regarding most political matters, but its neutral acceptance carried equivalent weight. Aldith accepted the commendation with a nod that suggested she'd already moved mentally to the next problem. She'd kept samples of the bedroom rug situation though. The pelts from the 17 creatures she'd personally killed had been processed and preserved. They were currently being studied by materials scientists, who were genuinely fascinated by the durability of the hide and what it suggested about alpha killer biology at the cellular level. The bedroom rug comment Admiral Huxus said to her afterward, his crystalline form glowing in that satisfied way that indicated strategic success. Was that literal or metaphorical? Literal, Aldith replied without hesitation. Killed the first 2 creatures on a space station with minimal resources. Couldn't exactly bury them. Couldn't process them through standard disposal. But their hides were surprisingly durable, and I needed something to keep the cold from coming through the floor of my makeshift shelter. So they became a rug. Later, when I had actual resources, I kept using them because they were genuinely comfortable. Turns out apex predators have surprisingly excellent cushioning properties. The Lumenthid mural seemed momentarily disturbed by this information, then fascinated. That's incredibly practical. That's incredibly human. Aldith corrected. We see materials where others see obstacles. We see problems where others see disasters. It's gotten us through pretty much everything trying to kill us. The Outer Dominion had stopped making hostile overtures. They'd pivoted instead to establishing trade agreements for neural disruptor components and requesting human military consultants. It was the path every spacefaring faction took when they realized they couldn't acquire power through force, but could acquire it through partnership. The Dominion was learning to play politics the way the galaxy preferred, which mostly meant pretending they weren't planning something hostile while actually planning something hostile, but doing it with better manner. Hayes found Aldith in the observation deck later, watching the star system scroll past the viewport. The Alpha Killer threat had forced the galaxy to develop new technologies, new strategies, and new ways of thinking. It had also forced the galaxy to take humans seriously as something more than the species that had accidentally innovated coffee technology. You could stay, Hayes said. High Council position, full military authority, chance to shape galactic defense policy for the next decade, and spend all day in meetings. Aldith shook her head. I've got courier routes that need running, salvage operations that need managing. There are a lot of dead space stations out there with useful equipment, just waiting to be harvested. Besides, someone needs to keep doing field work, keep learning, keep pushing the boundaries of what we know about these creatures. The Alpha Killers are nearly extinct in this sector, Hayes pointed out. Sector, Aldith emphasized. There's a whole galaxy, and extinction is probably overestimating the threat level right now. But creatures that adapt to eliminate threats are usually creatures that also adapt to find new habitats. I'd bet money that within 2 years, we find Alpha Killers in sectors we haven't even classified yet. Hayes smiled. It was the smile of someone who understood exactly what Aldith meant and approved of the logic. Then I guess you'll be busy. Exactly, Aldith said. Which brings me to my next point. The bedroom rug. Still in my court. It's genuinely the most comfortable thing I've ever owned. And I've owned luxury furniture. There's something about knowing exactly what your cushioning is made of that makes relaxation easier. That's the most human thing I've ever heard. Hayes, that's the most survival thing I've ever said. Aldith corrected. Humans survived by using everything available. Wasting resources was literally death. That efficiency, that pragmatism, that willingness to benefit from every part of the problem, that's not unique to humans. That's universal to any species that actually survives long enough to become galactic powers. The witness had somehow manifested in the observation deck without anyone noticing, which was both a feat of quantum mechanics and deeply unsettling. You believe humans will continue to be valuable to galactic security. I believe humans will continue being what they've always been, Aldith said, which is adaptable, creative, and deeply stubborn about finding solutions nobody else would consider. You'll call us up when you need something killed that won't die through conventional means. We'll show up, figure out how to make it dead, and probably use the corpse for something practical. It's what we do. The witness dimmed, in what might have been amusement, an accurate assessment. The galaxy has learned to fear the unknown threats. It would be wise to ensure humans remain allies rather than problems. As the witness faded back into quantum superposition, Aldith returned to watching the starfield. Somewhere out there, Alpha Killers were still evolving, adapting, and planning their next migration. Somewhere out there, humans were already planning how to meet them. It was the way the universe worked now. Fear had shifted to respect. Respect had shifted to partnership, and partnership had shifted to the galaxy, finally understanding what humans had always known. Survival wasn't about being the strongest, it was about being willing to do what everyone else thought was impossible.